My journey on this path of research started a cold October morning. Much like all my October mornings, I'd rolled out of bed 10 minutes before, got out of my elevator, walked towards the door of my apartment building. I was still half asleep, but this morning, like some other mornings, I grabbed the handle, as I normally do, and I pulled. Unfortunately, the door to my building is a push door, so that didn't get me anywhere. I looked behind myself and my doorman, he was trying to hold back laughter. It was a little embarrassing. But I went on with my day. Yet, as I walked to school, a question sort of materialized in my brain, which was what are the processes that forced my mind to make the obviously wrong decision in that situation? And the natural extension to that question is, what are the processes that govern our decision making as a whole? And through learning, answering those two questions, I've began to sort of consciously realize processes that for all of you are completely unconscious in your decision making. I also began to notice all the terrible decisions I made every day, from spending too much money at the convenience store to procrastinating my homework. All of this I saw through a different lens by learning about my decision-making process. But I think the most sort of illuminating thing that I learned from that journey was how badly our world, the human world, my school, my house, is built for this decision-making process. But how do we actually make decisions? There are two systems built into the human mind for the decision-making process. System one is the automatic system. Those are the decisions we make without thinking. They're unconscious, and they're heavily reliant on the sensory inputs at the moment of choice. So a good example of that was my door. My automatic system saw the handles that were vertical like this, and my monkey brain went, handle fit hand, hand pull. Unfortunately, as I should have known, it says push right above, but now I do it less, I suppose. The second system is what we normally think of as decision making. This is choosing which college to go to, choosing what burger to get, those sorts of things. And this second system, which is the reflective system, is what I want to dig into today. So we know the first step in the reflective system is identifying decisions. To make a choice, we need to know that a choice is available. And I'm going to run through the example of ordering any certain bagel. So for me to know that that choice is available, I need to understand the fact that up the road is a delicious bagel store selling freshly baked bagels at a good price in a nice environment. I also have to recognize that I'm hungry, and that's something that I desire. Funnily enough, when you start looking at things through this lens, you'll realize that a lot of bad decision making actually happens when the chooser doesn't know that a decision is even being presented to them in the first place. The second step in the decision making process is information gathering. For example, now I've walked into the bagel store and I'm looking around, looking at what other people are eating. There's an old man eating white fish at that table. It's very unappealing. There's a babysitter, eating a muffin. It looks pretty good. I'm also going to recall sort of my prior biases and conceptions to help guide the way I process this information and the way I'm able to make the decision itself. A problem arises, though, when there's too much information being presented. We get overloaded and we're unable to analyze all of it. Sorry, that was not meant to happen. So another process happens alongside this gathering of information, which is identifying alternatives. Once we're in this environment, right, to make a decision and we're gathering this information, we're going to look at what are the alternative choices I can find. And there's a term used in this field, dominant alternatives, which are sort of reasonable alternatives any user might take. So for example, I'm not going to walk into the bagel store, go up to the cashier and say, I'd like a gallon of butane fuel. That's a completely, unexpected thing that we cannot expect a decision maker to do that. A dominant alternative would be ordering any of the things that the store has on the menu. But a problem occurs when there's too many dominant alternative choices present. Normally, a little more than 6 makes this problem happen, and that problem is choice overload. And we see this very often times in our grocery stores and, I guess, here in New York, delis, where there are a ton of different, very similar products in the same category that it becomes extremely difficult to make the ideal choice because there's so many different, extremely similar options that you can't reasonably analyze that many options against each other, so you end up getting lazy and grabbing a random thing off the shelf. I mean, think about the milk aisle, right? You have all these different types of milk, skim milk, 2% milk, almond milk, oat milk, all with 5 or 6 individual brands. How can you choose the best milk for you when there's too much variety? And in economics, we sort of think more variety is good for the consumer, but here we see that when the consumer is given too much variety, their ability to choose accurately is really diminished. So after we've identified all the alternatives, it's time to weigh the evidence. This is done through something called welfare mapping, which is sort of how our brain weighs evidence in that context. Is it looks at different dominant alternative choices and considers the way that dominant alternative, the domino effect that choosing that will make to end up giving me a certain amount of welfare in the future. And whichever dominant alternative will give me the most welfare in the future will be the one I eventually choose. So as you can see, this is like an example of the mental process. I'm hungry beforehand, then I get my delicious bagel, and I'm full and happy and relaxed at the end. And the brain does this welfare mapping thing in 2 different ways. And to look at that, we're going to be looking at 2 siblings, Sam the satisficer and Max the maximizer. So Sam and Max are both in the market for a computer monitor, right? But they go about choosing one, and they all have the same criteria, but they go about choosing one in different ways. Sam, on one hand, analyzes all the possible computer monitors on the market. He reads articles, looks at many price ranges on Amazon to find which computer monitor is going to be the best value for a given price. She's very concerned in all her decision making with making the best possible choice and is more likely to experience buyer's remorse after. Max, on the other hand, makes decisions like this. He has a rigid set of criteria for his computer monitor, and he's going to buy whichever monitor meets that set of criteria. So Max, in his decision making, is less concerned with the decision itself and more with the utility from that resulting decision. So he's more likely to make the suboptimal choice, or in this example, pay more. Finally, we're at the last step of the decision-making process, which is to take action. Once we've identified what the optimal choice is, say in this bagel scenario, I've identified that I want a plain, well-toasted bagel with cream cheese and capers. It's a weird order, I know, don't hate me. The decision task, which is the word to describe sort of the action of making a decision to get that bagel, to make that choice, is to tell the technical difficulty, is it working? All right, it's to tell the cashier, doesn't want to listen. Is it working now? Is to tell, all right, I'm gonna just keep going. All right, is to tell the cashier that I would like a well-toasted plain bagel with cream cheese and capers. So, interestingly, one of the things that really affects our decisions is the difficulty of this decision task itself. Let's take, for instance, scrolling through TikTok, right? The designers of TikTok and many similar social media apps have an understanding of this quirk in the human decision process. They understand that because the decision to close TikTok and put my attention on something else, say working on my TED Talk, is much more difficult than the decision to simply swipe up and watch a new 15-second clip, they're able to take advantage of the fact that even though we know that we really should be working on something productive, we spend hours and hours mind-numbingly scrolling through these apps. So doing nothing can also be a very powerful decision. Can also be a decision. Those are called defaults. What is this graph behind me? Well, this graph shows the data for instance of people signing up to organ donation programs in various European countries. As you can see, there's a really, really weird stagnation in the data here. That 4 European nations have extremely low participation in the programs, whereas the rest have almost complete participation. And I think we all can agree organ donation is an extremely important sort of facet of society. People need organs for surgeries and the like. What if I told you that sort of Columbia scientists, behavioral scientists looking at this, were trying to figure out this problem. And when they started digging deeper, they looked at the actual DMV forms for signing up for this organ donation program. And what they found was stunning. Basically, the countries with very low participation in those programs had check boxes similar to the one up top, where you would have to check the box if you wanted to participate. Whereas the ones with very high participation had check boxes where you'd have to check the box if you didn't want to participate. What does this mean? This basically means that because the default option was to not check a box, people had a far higher rate to not participate in this program, even though everybody thinks organ donation is important. So I think we can all agree that the decision-making process is a brilliant, beautiful, and sometimes irrational thing that affects our life in the most fundamental ways possible. If we think about it, everything we do can be structured into a decision. From choosing to get out of bed in the morning and go to school, to navigating the streets of New York and the halls of your office, our decision-making process guides sort of all of that. This leads us to a problem. Most of the human design things we use in our everyday life, like my school or this remote, are not designed to serve this decision-making process. And this leads to getting lost. This leads to frustration in not being able to use something. And that's why I call for sort of a revolution in design thinking. One that understands that a knowledge of the decision-making process is fundamental to good design for people. How can they do this? As you can see, people are making decisions everywhere, right? How can they do that? To design for the decision-making process, we have to start by identifying decision points. And we can think of those sort of in the abstract sense as a fork in the road, a place in which we have to make a decision within the environment or thing you're designing. Once we found that, we then have to identify which choice is correct for any given outcome, right? Pretty simple. So now we have those two things done. The last thing to do is to shape the environment surrounding that decision in a way that ensures that the user can most easily identify what the correct choice at that point might be. And a couple rules and strategies to do this are, first, we should limit the number of choices to 6. As I mentioned earlier, more than 6 choices will give the person choice overload. They're going to make a less sort of optimal choice because they're lazy. We should also expect error. People make mistakes a lot, and a design that is more forgiving to error, that lets people go back and correct their mistakes, is an optimal one. People also do well with feedback. If your design can tell people somehow when they're doing well and when they're doing badly, that'll make it far more efficient. Finally, we should really control information. We need to give people the least amount of information possible that'll give them a very high confidence in their decision. And we can do this in a couple ways. We can do it through universal language, so that's stuff like relative size, color, shapes, lines and arrows. And finally, keep it simple, right? Too much information, too much clutter just makes things undecipherable, and people could miss very important pieces of information. So I think that using this design philosophy, or at least prioritizing an understanding of the decision-making process, can create a more convenient and easy future. You know, imagine a world where everything we interact with, navigate, and use on a daily basis has a nearly magical approachability and ease of use. A world where it's almost impossible to get lost in train station, airports, and the like, because every choice you make is somehow always the right one. A world where the frustration of not knowing how to use something is almost fully eliminated. This is why I propose this revolution in the design philosophy. Designers should be designing for users and should be prioritizing their ability to use above all else. Central to that is understanding and implementing an understanding of the decision-making process, because fundamentally that's what will be navigating those designed things and spaces. In the meantime, I think we should all be more conscious of the way we make decisions and the decisions we make, as well as be more empathetic in understanding other people and how and why they make their decisions. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the show.